Welcome to everyone who is joining us this morning. I'm Jazz Merrick, and I am a global director within AGS Client Delivery. Been with AGS for 10 years and in the industry for 17. And as I go around to my panelists, who are fantastic, I'll ask everyone to share a fun fact. I'll start with mine. I recently became a first-time aunt, and I am extremely proud of my niece who's already killing it. So I will hand it over to Laura to go ahead and
Thanks,
introduce
Jazz.
herself.
Congratulations on the new baby. Laura White, and I'm with Microsoft. I sit in Microsoft's procurement organization, and I specifically manage our North American program, which I have for the last 7 years. So the longest job I have ever had in my 17 years at Microsoft has been in this role. So I had absolutely no background in contingent staffing before I entered this role 7 years ago. So it's been quite a journey of learning. But I do know Microsoft really, really well, and was a big help to me in the journey to increase adoption and ultimately mandate use of this program at Microsoft. Fun fact that I just learned, my middle name is Jean. That I've known for a very long time. What I didn't know is that Reese Witherspoon's name, her real name is Lora Jean. Can you believe that? So, you know, I
Famous adjacent.
share a name with a famous actress. That's my fun fact.
Not bad, Laura.
Crystal.
So I'm Crystal Price. I'm also here at Microsoft as a senior program manager within procurement. So I'm Laura's peer. My remit is over the EMEA region. So there's 16 countries that Mark and I both work in. And I also have responsibility into our IC and freelance services programs as well here at Microsoft. I have been in the contingent, industry for staffing industry for almost 20 years, if I have to say that out loud. Everything from recruitment to sales and account management to working within the MSP, customer side, talent acquisition, and now hopefully my home of homes at Microsoft. So it's been 3 years here and I love every moment of it. And my personal fact is I am the youngest of 10 kids. So we have a lot of fun celebrating our holidays, and we've got a really big one coming up here. So we're excited to all get together. Mark?
Thanks, Crystal. Your Thanksgiving must have been hectic when you were growing up.
So much
So,
turkey.
Mark Bridge, Allegis, worked with Allegis as program executive, working alongside Crystal, supporting EMEA and Jazz. I've been kind of fell into the industry, as does most people. Been in the recruitment industry for 13-ish years, most of which been supporting multi-country MSP programs. Fun fact, whether it's fun or not for me, I don't know, but I'm 11 months into 12 months of running half marathon every single month for the year. So coming to the end of that, and we'll be having a word with myself as to whether I continue that next year or not. But the jury's out. The jury's out. Yeah.
That's impressive.
Very.
Yes. All right, we'll hit a few housekeeping items before we jump into our content for today. So all lines are muted. So if you have any questions or need to reach out, please in the upper right-hand side, you'll see a box that will access the questions window. You can use that to send questions through in the chat for when we do our Q&A later, or if you're having any technical challenges, just go ahead and use that chat. Without further ado, let's jump in. So to set the stage for what we're going to cover today, we really want to take you on the journey that we've been on in partnership over the last couple of years. We'll start with what drove the change and the need for it. We'll move into how we put together the business case, ultimately what we implemented, our lessons learned, and then what's next. And then we'll leave some time at the end for a little bit of Q&A. So let's jump right in. And let's start with our why. And maybe, Laura, you can kick us off with talking a little bit about what were the catalysts that shed light on the need for holistic program transformation?
Yeah, well, just a little bit of background. So this program, our contingent program at Microsoft, has been around for a lot of years. So, 10, 15 plus years the program had been in place, but it was always something that was available to utilize if you wish. Right. So as an FTE at Microsoft, you needed to hire a contractor. You could come through this program, or you could go straight to a supplier of your choosing, as long as they were an available supplier at Microsoft. So there had always been a lot of options available in our organization to procure contractor services, which, by the way, is what we call ourselves. The program brand is Contractor Services, and it's limited to staff augmentation in its scope. But with this freedom across the organization of 220,000 plus employees at Microsoft, basically everybody was able to act as a buyer, right? And when that many people in an organization have the ability to buy these types of services, it makes it very difficult to buy it well. And it makes it very difficult to accomplish some of the enterprise level objectives that a company like us has. So, as the slide here points out, driving diverse spend is one of those challenges. Um, Through the program, we're able to cast a wide net. And this is something that we would share with the various organizations through the company that we chat with about, why they would want to use our program for staff augmentation. We have the system, the process, the support infrastructure to cast a wide net for talent, right? So whereas an individual employee looking for contractor talent at the company, they have all the resources in the world, but don't know how to navigate them. Whereas we have a system and a process to reach many suppliers at once, right? So anybody with a contingent program, an MSP, VMS, you know the infrastructure that you have in place and your ability to reach the market, right? Our organizations internally are accountable for diversity spend. It isn't just a procurement accountability, although we certainly keep up with the business on that. So one of the services we were able to bring to the company is the ability to help them drive diversity spend. So through our program, we can accomplish some pretty significant things, but with everybody operating on their own, going to whatever supplier they wish to procure staff augmentation, you don't get a consistent result when it comes to diversity spend. So centralizing that through our program has made a big impact at Microsoft. Secondly, it's very expensive to procure these types of services outside of a program like ours that's informed by competitive market rates, that facilitates a competitive sourcing process. So if you're kind of on your own in the business and you need to find a contractor to do work for you, typically what you do is you reach out to a supplier right? Supplier maybe two that right? And you find out what type of talent they can provide you to perform a scope of work. We monitored spend on those types of resources for years and compared it to what we spent from a rate perspective in the program. And the delta was about 16%, right? So we pay about 16% more procuring the same services outside of a program like ours versus in, because we facilitate that competitive sourcing process, which just isn't even a practical option for folks when they're not leveraging a program like this. Secondly, we found with the business that they were very commonly overbuying. So for example, I need a contractor, I go to a supplier, I know they provide the talent that they have, right? Which may be somebody more senior with more capabilities than this particular scope of work requires, right? So between the non-competitive sourcing, the overbuying, Microsoft was spending a lot more than we needed to, much higher than what we now view as the max market rates through our program, a good 25% over that across the company. So the financial case to mandate or require use of a program like this was really strong, really great business case. But I don't want to leave the impression it was all about spend or all about budget, because it wasn't. This program has long been viewed as a compliance program. We bring controls to procurement of these types of resources that simply don't exist outside of the program. So everything from, is it properly contracted, properly purchased? At Microsoft, we require purchase orders. Are those in place before work begins? Is access properly provisioned? Is access turned off when contractors offboard? Without the controls that we bring to the process, we found all types of behaviors within the business, right? So huge opportunity to optimize our cost, to enforce compliance behaviors, and also, and this is equally important, driving efficiency for the business, right? So you can think of the actual spend, what we pay for contractors to support the business, and then we can also measure cost through efficiency and time. So we had, over the years, performed time studies, which actually Allegis helped us with back in the day, to measure how long it would take a sponsor, that's what we call hiring managers at Microsoft, how long it would take a sponsor to source, onboard, manage, offboard an assignment without the services that this program provides. And the difference was 11 and a half hours, right? So if you take that 11 and a half hours and you multiply it times all of the staff augmentation contractors at Microsoft that weren't procured and managed through our contingent program, it is a very large sum when you think about the average cost of Microsoft FTE for an hour of their time, right? So when we made our business case, it was very much about driving cost efficiency, improving compliance, improving delivery against our DE&I initiatives. So really kind of important goals. The next thing I'll mention is just the sheer lack of visibility, right? When you don't have a central way of onboarding and documenting contractors at the company, it makes it very difficult, not only for HR, for procurement, groups like us who manage and monitor how we use workforce at the company, makes it very difficult to get that view, but also in the business. And in our role, we do a lot of engagement. We travel the business a lot. We talk to them about their needs. And one of the most common things they would ask for is, hey, can I just see how many contractors we have in our organization right now? You could be talking to a chief of staff within a particular organization, a business manager, and they're tasked with understanding what their resource availability is to get the work done that they need to get done, how much they're paying for it, how it aligns with their budgets, and how to forecast. All of these kinds of things were made very difficult because that information, was either unavailable when they were sourcing headcount and resources outside of the program, or it was incomplete, right? So you may be able to see, for example, that, a particular, let's say, gaming studio at Microsoft has, 400 contractors supporting it, but you wouldn't be able to see very easily when do all of these assignments end, how long have they been in place, what are we paying hourly, what type of work is each of them doing, and it's really hobbling for a business to not understand and know that. So we've been able to, by driving all contingent spend through the program, provide a level of visibility that allows the business to plan in a way that they couldn't before, right? Which came in very valuable, especially at times when we've been under a lot of budget constraint and the economic environment is challenging. That understanding is just very, very important. Lastly, I just got to touch every one of these, Jazz, because
they're important.
Are so important, right? Because presumably, if you're listening to a call like this, you've either made a case to mandate or enforce use of your program through a policy, or you're trying to do it, right? So really understanding the whys, that's the value prop, right? That's making the case and having that conversation. But if you think about what it's like in a large organization, either as a supplier or as an employee trying to navigate this need, it's really challenging. You know, just describing what it means, for example, to hire a staff augmentation resource versus hire a deliverable project base or to fully outsource a service. You know, we talk that language all the time, but the business doesn't, right? And the suppliers don't, right? So you get all kinds of confusion about what type of resource is this? What's the proper channel for me to buy it? What can I do or what can't I do? And then suppliers who are asking the same thing and you get a different answer depending on who you ask. Just was not a level of organization and ease of business that we wanted at the company. So those are a few reasons, Jazz, a few catalysts for the change.
Absolutely. Really important reasons that resonated internally. One piece that I want to make sure that we don't miss is, Crystal, maybe you can speak to some of the nuance as we look to broaden this beyond just North America, some of the things that you all were thinking about from an EMEA lens.
Yeah, absolutely. So all the things that Laura touched on, majority were absolutely the same type of story that we were telling from the EMEA lens. But when you talk about EMEA, our program it has 16 countries that we have control over as far as our program with staff augmentation. So being able to dive in and understand all of the complexities from a compliance standpoint across those 15 countries was a huge undertaking. And so when you didn't have that same channeled experience through like a contractor services program, sponsors were having to figure out who to talk to if there was an issue, who do I go to versus having that single point of contact. So that became, more heightened as we were having these discovery sessions and conversations about our program. And then that rigor behind understanding those local labor laws. So when you talk about things like agency temp workers and how do we report that information, how do we make sure that we have full visibility across the different organizations on how they're utilizing those workers and if they are compliant with some of the other additional regulations by countries. So we think of things like IR35. There are penalties that are in place and tax implications that are, that can be implemented if we don't have the right resources in place or the right strategy in place as a company. So as we started thinking about things like that and building policies around in things like IR35, it was how do we make sure that there's a structure in place to ensure compliance so that we didn't have some of those things pop up as concerns when it came to, having our legal teams reach out and say, hey, there's a problem that we're responsible for. And then being able to understand how we interact with our workers' councils. Every country that has workers' councils has a different approach. There's different things that have to be signed off on, and not having Allegis there to make sure that they are mandated across the board and put into place. That again exposes us to risk, and this program really helps us tamp that down. And we also had policies that are in place, either it's procurement policies, HR policies. We are known for having policies, and again, being able to ensure that we can report that, have visibility to that, not just in the EMEA region, but in our Asia Pacific region as well. Those are also things that stood out to us. And just having that visibility overall within our regions outside of the US to be able to report in lockstep. So, we may not have some of the same like diversity goals in the US as we have in the EMEA countries, but still being able to have the data, have an understanding of what countries are striving to and understanding what those local labor laws are that they're pushing for as far as diversity, and then being able to work across our different organizations to start building a strategy to address some of those things.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Crystal. Thanks, Laura. That's a really good foundation as we start to talk about how did we then evolve that into a business case and what the journey was like. And I'm going to ask Laura to step us through this, but I think one of the important things to note is as you look at this was a journey that happened over time, and maybe the very last piece of it moved really quickly, but there was a lot of work done up front to really strengthen our business case. So Laura, maybe you can step us through what that looked like from your end.
Yeah, I'll actually start in the middle of this slide with prioritizing data, because I think it's very difficult to even attempt, trying to implement a policy mandate around your program if you don't understand the data that supports the business case. being able to go into, business groups within your company, and explain, right? Here's the way you're using talent, external talent today. Here's how you're buying the talent, and here's how it's impacting you, right? Not having that data to have those discussions with stakeholders, and also to make the case to senior leadership or whomever within your organization needs to agree, and approve, implementing a policy like we did. Really, it's a non-starter, right? So we very much knew what our value proposition was, and we put the data in place to be able to prove it out, um, across the enterprise at every organizational level. So, if, for example, we had a particular group within a particular organization, right, we could pull the data and say to a chief of staff or to, a CVP, whomever we're working with, right, we can say, here's your data. Here's your spend. Here's the number of resources. Here's how many we think are staff augmentation, and how many of those are in our program and how many of those aren't, and what that means, right? So we were able, to go into these organizations and say, you have a 30% adoption rate of the contingent program at Microsoft, which means you're overspending. You're not always compliant. You don't have the same controls that you could have. Your FTEs are spending a lot of valuable time that they could be spending doing the work you need them to do, right? But we were able to go in and have those very targeted conversations. One of the hardest things, and I think every group, that I've talked to, over the years, whether that was at an industry event or just other conversations I've had with, peers at other companies, many have a hard time distinguishing labor type, right? So you've got, most can tell you how many contractors they have, but they don't necessarily know how many kind of fit that staff augmentation model versus deliverable based, et cetera, right? And we didn't either. We could see the big list of names and what organization they were in, what their title was in the Microsoft address book, who they reported to. We could see all of that, and we knew which resources, which people were in our program. So that's easy. Those are staff augmentation resources, of course. We could see, what headcount were associated with outsourced deals at Microsoft. So I mean, like the fully outsourced deals, think like call centers and things like that, where you're turning over the whole business to an external supplier. We do tag that headcount with IDs, but you had this whole, list of folks in the middle. Are they staff augmentation or are they project based? We didn't know. So we put some parameters in place that would help us make a good, directionally correct, educated guess. And that was the most important thing we did. When I come into the program 7 years ago, one of my questions I had for my predecessor was, well, what percentage of people or, who are considered staff augmentation at the company were onboarded through this program? Like, what's the utilization or adoption rate? No idea. Really no idea. You have to derive some kind of baseline because you can never calculate what the overspend is. You can never make any of those estimates that, we made if you don't have some way of knowing. And, we made those estimates or put those parameters in place by talking with the business. One of the things that we discovered after having many conversations with the business where we literally go over lists of people, we would, have an organization with, 150 contractors in place at any given time. And, it can vary. Some will have 5,000, some will have 150, right? But if you kind of dive into the data and you talk through actual headcount with leadership in an organization at your company, and you do the exercise, if they have the appetite to really understand how they're spending, what these resources are, and you'll always find some takers. There's some businesses out there who really want to understand and do kind of a heavy lift with you to understand that. The only reason I go into that is because we did that many times. And what we discovered was when we looked at the data, whenever we saw a scenario where there was one or very few contractors from one supplier reporting to one Microsoft hiring manager, it was almost always staff fog. Sometimes it wasn't, but it most of the time was. So we built a formula into our data set, to our HR people data set to tag, we called it likely staff log, is what we called it in our report. So it's able to go into an organization and say, here's how many staff log you have in our contractor services program, here's how many outsourced, here's how many are in the middle. And we think, 40% of those are actually staff log and should have come through the program if you were utilizing it fully. Okay, so super important to try to understand and identify resource type, because that's the foundation of the entire business case to make a change, right? Start with that. Once you have some of those, components together, really got to increase awareness of the program. We hadn't done a very good job of that. We had done a lot of, kind of traveling the business and sharing and this sort of thing. But when it came to discovering the program, if you're just kind of traveling the halls of Microsoft, the virtual halls, right, online on our internet, you'd be poking around for a long time trying to figure out, how do I do this? Where do I buy this kind of service? It wasn't that easy. Even then, you'd still be hunting and pecking for where's the link to that Beeline thing, where I go do this. So it's we spent a good amount of time just kind of cleaning all of that up, getting our brand, really polished. We had a video on why would you use this program. The idea is to make it the most appealing choice, right? Most appealing choice. It's the easiest path, the most helpful path. As long as folks discover it, they can find it, they're much, much more likely to use it. So, we really emphasize that. I would say that, foundational to it as well was just our program's abilities. It's one thing to tell a good story. It's one thing to have a good business case around cost savings and compliance and diversity and all those sorts of things. But if you can't deliver the goods, that's a non-starter, right? So we really, really understood our program's performance. We had credibility. We knew that we could deliver, right? And that included things like, you get a business group and they'll say, yeah, I don't know, we have some pretty sophisticated needs. Take like devices group at Microsoft. We don't know if we've used you. We know you can hire project managers for us. We've done that sort of thing, but we need thermal testers, and those are staff aug for us. I would say assess if they're right. Most of the time the business was not right. Most of the time we were able to fill all the roles that they needed, but we try to stay humble through that process, right? Make sure they're not right. Right? Can you really fill the needs that they have? And if you can't, you've got to close those gaps. So we added titles, through our program with Allegis' help, and made all of those assessments and closed a few gaps across our supply base and our title catalog to support that. That's important. Driving organic growth. This is a full-time job if that's the way you go about it. But I do think it's an important step in the journey. We spent several years doing that. We got from about 30% adoption up to 48 to 52 is kind of where we hovered before we forced use of the program through policy. And it was very hard to get there. Very hard. It was, we really leveraged and mobilized our engagement organization, whereas like Crystal and I are program managers, we ensure this program operates well and evangelize it and all of that. But we have a very large team of engagement managers in procurement who are assigned to the business groups at Microsoft. We made the pitch to them just as if they were the users of the program. Like, all the things you want to talk to your business stakeholders about, put this one at the top. This is where they have an opportunity, and you have an opportunity as their procurement partner to direct them there, right? We showed them, here's how much this organization would save every year if they were buying these types of resources properly. Here's how much time they would save. We had a templated deck. And we, meaning myself, Crystal, my peers, and Allegis, like we had counterparts. They could give that spiel as well as we could. They could produce that template. They designed the template actually to say, very specific business group. Here is your opportunity in like a one-page snapshot. Here's all the data behind it. When do you want to review it? We got to the point with the business where they were saying, it would be so much easier if you guys just kind of forced people through your buying channel, right? Rather than make us try to get people to do it, because they didn't have the bandwidth to constantly, review and force and question people about how they were buying services either. Got to the point where they were just like, procurement, please just take care of that for us so that we know what's happening, right? That's a beautiful place to be, right? Where the business is saying, why are you making this such a choice if you know it's the right thing to do and we agree with you, right? So that's kind of how we ended up, really progressing to the point that we could make a very high level pitch in securing the mandate. So what did that look like? Very high level. At my highest level you can be at Microsoft to get alignment with that. And just because Microsoft doesn't want to be a big, slow, cumbersome technology company, right? We want to be agile, unconstrained, by processes and procedures, able to get the work done and innovate, right? That's what we want to be able to do. The minute you introduce a service that looks like it's going to slow people down, like it's going to add bureaucracy and unnecessary steps, and it's just a no-go, you know? So we reserve policy decisions for the most important things. Procurement offers a lot of guidance that has a small handful of policies. So the business case had to be very tight, right, to go to the senior most leadership at Microsoft and say, this is deserving of a policy change because these are the impacts to the company. So as I started talking about that data and the baseline data and measuring the opportunity and what we were leaving on the table and all of those different ways I talked about, summing that up across the entire organization at Microsoft was an undeniable business case with a lot of spend and a lot of savings attached to it. We got very quick alignment on it. And in fact, our CFO agreed that any exceptions to the policy would need to be approved by her peers, the EVPs of the company. So it was very important and taken really seriously. Those are a few of the recipes that helped us get there, Jazz.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One of the things that you mentioned was the piece around proving that we could do it. And then the piece around getting that buy-in from groups to say, hey, why don't you just force people to come to the program? That seems like the right choice. Crystal and team secured the first group to actually fully come in ahead of the full program mandate. Crystal, do you want to talk a little bit about how we achieved that full country mandate in Ireland ahead of the global rollout?
Yeah, absolutely. It was a lot of leveraging that, driving organic growth and then prioritizing countries where we would have the most impact and return on our investment as far as the evangelizing and going, country to country in each leadership group, because we're almost thinking about it as individual companies when you start looking at the countries and then individual groups within those countries and how do you level it up to get the right audience to be able to tell our story. So we actually worked alongside with our PIM, our procurement engagement manager, who was able to leverage her relationships with some of the senior leaderships in our country, which was actually Ireland, to start having those conversations about our mandate. So it went from just evangelizing the program to being bold and asking for the mandate. That was the first time our program had done that at a country level. And she was able to get us into the room with those stakeholders, with those leaders. They had a roundtable conversation every month, and she was part of those conversations. So she was able to not only get us into the room, be able to tell that story, and then get their feedback so that we could start driving for that mandate. And so we talked about it earlier, being ready for those, well, what if and why not and will this work for each group, and being able to tell that story to answer some of those questions that would come up or those concerns. And because our program was ready, our brand was ready, our ease of use was there, and we could tell that story. We got the nod to move it forward. And so without these pieces on this slide here, we would not have been able to make that bold ask and to get that to move forward. And then once we had that mandate established, we were able to run it for several months, having our full reporting, being able to show our successes as far as how we were managing compliance, how we were reporting out to leadership on their savings, on their growth within the program. That helped us build that foundational story to tell to our LT, our leadership teams, to ask for a full mandate for our program. And we didn't think it was going to be something that was possible to do, but once we had that done, it was, we decided to go forward and strike while the iron was hot to make those asks.
Mm-hmm. It was really helpful to be able to say, hey, we've done this in Ireland. It's not such a strange concept. We have a whole country. I think by then we even had India.
Yeah.
We had a mandate in India as well, and a few business groups that just along the way, rolled out internal like business group level policies to say we procure all staff aug through this program, right? And they had all the same troubles we do, when it comes to enforcing and controlling, and that's a whole nother, part of the story. But having some proof in terms of use case was really helpful.
Yeah, helped us create that momentum.
Yeah.
As we transition into the how, maybe Mark, you can talk a little bit from the program office lens. What did this look like for us as we got into executing?
Yes, I definitely agree with everything the Lord said on that last slide. Speaks so eloquently about how we've done it and how we got to this point. I think from a program office perspective, it was all around preparation, around planning, and giving us the best opportunity to succeed and make the best of the mandate. Thinking back, being in lockstep, being together as the PMO, as the MSP provider, but also working closely with Crystal, with Lora from the EMEA region and from a global perspective was so important in making this a success. When we think about how we made it work, we had to make sure that the messaging was correct, right? And the communication plan and the change plan was strong. When we looked at the communications and the documentation, making sure that the email templates were all templated, that the FAQ documents were all thorough and detailed, intranet pages that people would go to, that they were all ready and waiting for when this was launched. But also, this was maybe just after COVID, so people were going back into the office. So making sure that we utilised digital signages and using all the different kind of medias and forms that were available. From a PMO perspective, making sure that the teams were ready, set up for success. They knew what they needed to do with regards to documentation, legislation, what they can and can't do, what they shouldn't do. But as well, making sure that the message that we're giving as the PMO and as the MSP is backed up by the client. We're not going out on a limb. We're there to enforce the policies. We don't make the policies.
Yeah. And I know, Laura, we were partnered with you and Crystal and other counterparts. Maybe you can step a little bit through what was happening behind the scenes once we got the change.
Yeah.
It happened really quickly. What were the steps we took to operationalize?
Yeah, it was really fast. I mean, it felt like we made the case for years and then had to implement it overnight practically. It was November of 2022 that we got the go on it, and it was expected to be live by January 2023. So, it was like 2 months. I think the first call we made was to UJazz to say, okay, roughly how many staff augmentation headcount we have outside of the program, which translates to, roughly this many more asks a month. So we had to make some assumptions about run rate and things like that, make sure that Allegis could support it. right? If our volume spikes like that, especially in January timeframe when there is a lot more purchasing going on, do we have the capacity? Can we deliver a good experience? And Jazz, I don't know if you want to share any of your secret sauce. We got the typical yes that we get from Allegis,
Yeah.
which is we put great trust in. What did you have to do though?
It's so easy. Very simple. So we got that we got the call. I think it was the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, saying, "Hey, we're going to proceed with this.
Uh-huh.
We essentially need to mobilize over the next 6 weeks." And so the first step was honestly getting on the phone with you all to understand what are we going to do, what's our target, what's our goal, what's it going to look like. And once we had that, to your point, we started to make some educated assumptions around here's what we think the revenue spike will look like, or the requisition spike, the number of suppliers that we needed to partner with. And from there, internally at AGS, I partnered to pull over some of our best resources to join our program team. We rapidly mobilized to get them trained up, access, background checks, all the things that you need to do as
Yeah.
you're nearly doubling the size of the team.
Yep.
And then we rolled out a real change management plan led by our transformation executive, who helped to really put together the project plan for all the different pieces that needed to come together. Mark touched on some of those. There's a lot of really tactical things that seem small, but can really upset the apple cart if you're not thinking through who needs to be communicated to internally, externally, supplier partners, our VMS partners, which is Beeline in this case. How do we make sure that we have all of the workflows ready and then continue to be lockstep? If there's one thing I can continue to emphasize, it's the partnership piece and staying lockstep on our goals, especially knowing this was going to be bumpy, and we knew that. And that was okay because we understood that the runway would get us to the end, to the goal we were trying to achieve. But having that level of comfort to say, we reserve the right to pivot, we reserve the right to change. And we executed, and then as we went into that first two quarters that we had this live, we were constantly assessing, pivoting, changing, updating, modifying process, people, systems, to make sure that we landed where we needed to. And you can see some of the collateral things on the screen that we built to help supplement the change. But yeah, it's a lot of being incredibly flexible, adaptable, and quickly to react to the change.
I think we said we were building the plane as we were flying sometimes, weren't we?
Yeah, I think we tried very hard to think of what is every question that we could get asked here, and that's actually how we actually kind of built kind of the business rule. There's policy, which is you must buy this service this way, right? That was in some ways the easy part, but we had to draft all of that. We had to connect with HR and make sure that the language they were using kind of in their, internal materials matched what we were saying. Because most of the policies pertaining to external staffing at Microsoft were really owned by HR. We support the buying programs and all that, right? And enforcement to many of those policies. But we noticed they were using slightly different language than we were. So we had to get all of that language consistent internally, because when you're going to push something out that's going to affect 200,000 plus employees, you better be clear. Arriving at absolute clarity was super important. So policy, what were the parameters of the policy? What's the exception process for the policy? Don't trick yourself into thinking you're going to have no exceptions, because there's always going to be something that warrants exception. And as a program owner, you want to be able to facilitate that exception if you need to. We had two exception types. One was, I just think I need to go outside of this program because I have a special resource. I have a supplier who's uniquely capable. I have some nuanced, unique need. In those cases, or I want to, spend 150%, 200%, whatever the case is, of the maximum bill rate facilitated by contractor services. We set a very high bar, and I think that was one of the things we did right. We required EVP approval, and we spun up a little Power App, a little request tool. People would email and say, "Oh, I have so and so's approved the exception." Nope, you got to go to this tool, and you have to enter, what you're asking, the justification, and it's going to route all the way up. It's going to route to your finance controller first, then it's going to route to the EVP. And the minute you enter the notion that you need exceptionally high level approval for this, I mean, EVPs at Microsoft report directly to Satya Nadella. You generally don't interact with those people as a typical employee of the company, right? So having to make that kind of a case, it's like, is it really important to me? I don't know. Do I really want to go say to this EVP that I'm special and I need an exception? It forces you to reassess your own need, right? Do you really want to go die on that hill? So we took very few exception requests, but we had that option. We also said that if we cannot fill the role for you, right? If you do happen to be one of these really niche needs, or there's just something so special about this business and the person you need, we'll give you the exception. So we had the ability to grant exception in cases where we could not source. And that happened rarely. It's happened a few times, but it's been rare. But it was very reassuring to the business to be able to tell them that if we encounter that, it's going to be fine. You'll be able to go to the supplier you always do. We'll send you there, right? So that was really helpful. Figuring out, when does this start? What do you do with all of the contractors that are already in place? Are you going to force a cutover at some point? How do you deal with the suppliers? That was actually one of the more complex parts of implementing a policy like this. So Microsoft has a supplier network of thousands and thousands of suppliers, many of whom provide staff augmentation at Microsoft, many of whom have been around for years and years and years, have deep relationships with the business. How are you going to deal with all that, right? The idea that you're going to port all of those suppliers into a program like this is not isn't viable, right? So you have to kind of come up with, what does that transition plan look like? We opted to avoid disruption to the business for the most part, right? So if you had an existing resource, they could continue for a period of time that would cover most business needs, right? But starting on January 1, 2023, any new request follows this process. Now, super important to identify who you're going to tell all this to, right? So it's one thing to kind of sit in the core team and go, okay, these are all the business rules. This is how we'll deal with every scenario that comes up. This is the exception process. These are the parameters of the policy. This is what the policy says. It's one thing to do all that. It's another thing to start making your rounds to business to tell them this. So we had our materials ready to go, and we leveraged the engagement organization, and our finance controllers played a really big part. These are the people at Microsoft that control budgets, right? They control spend. They're the ones in the room with the business when they're forecasting and they're locking their budgets. That person has a lot of insight and influence and ability to control, right? So we first met with the controllers and explained to them what we were trying to do and why, got their buy-in, and then went around to every major business group at Microsoft, which meant we were busy every day, multiple meetings a day, explaining that this was what was going to change, right? So that was a piece of it.
That's awesome. And you've started to touch a little bit on the lessons learned. We've hit on a couple of these, the data component. We've talked through the change management. From the know your audience piece, maybe we could talk a little bit about that, Crystal, just around the importance of how we partnered internally to get to the right folks.
Yeah, absolutely. So as we mentioned before, we had senior leadership buy-in, which was, the biggest step forward. But having had those adoption conversations, having talked to different business groups about what our program could offer, making sure we had visibility within all of our major groups and our partners, whether it was within our legal teams, within our controller and finance groups, throughout our procurement, HR, having those partners in place and ready to go. And then them also having that buy-in and being in lockstep with us to make sure that they were also on board with having the same messaging that we would have. So we worked to make sure we were identifying those early influencers within the business. Like Laura mentioned earlier, not only did we have certain countries that were moving toward mandates, but certain business groups as well. And then being able to have them continue to tell our story as well as we were building some of those successes. And then, understanding from our audience, like where we were going to have pushback. So you've again got people saying that you can't fill our positions. How are you going to save us money? We're doing it easier our own way by having one-on-one relationships. Why do I have to go through the competitive sourcing process? I know the supplier that I want to use. And then being able to have some of those conversations that would really back into, why competitive sourcing was a benefit to them, how we could save them money, how we could save them time. So, being able to address all of those things with our audience so that we could understand who our detractors were and then make them aligned with and promoters of our program. And then understanding, again, what are those kind of pain points that fall into that? Where have you had, maybe you experienced our program, a month ago and you just didn't have success filling your role. Being able to dig into that and understand like why some of those things happen, and then being able to either fill in a gap, build a strategy around it, or being able to talk through those one-offs and those nuances. So you kind of got it from all different directions when it came to knowing our audience. But again, having that consistent story, having the data to back it, were all keys to our success. So that as we moved up into the leadership ranks, we were all aligned.
It's fantastic. And I know we've hit on some of these other pieces. The one last piece I would leave here before we hop into some Q&A is around readiness. Ensure that you're ready before you pull the trigger, because it's really hard to walk it back. And if you end up with sort of a black eye for your program, that's not ideal. Having said that, readiness does not mean perfection. And readiness will look different for each organization. For us, what that looked like is a driving need to hit on those business goals that Laura stepped us through in the beginning of our session, and understanding the balance between how ready we need to be to hit those goals and what things we're willing to continue to evolve and build, as Mark said, as we flew the plane. So being really honest with yourself, partnering with your MSP partner, having us at the table was really helpful to be able to consistently be able to come back and say, how do we need to evolve, adapt, and strategize? And then has brought us to where we are today. What I want to do next, I'm going to stop sharing, is talk a little bit about what's next. And we've had a couple of questions come in that touch on that a bit. So I'm going to go a little rogue and share, or actually toss one of the questions. So one of the questions that we had come in was, does the program include all resource-based contracts and engagements? For example, people-based contracts, or just Microsoft run all third-party spend through a program, software contracts? And then there's another question related to that around, does Allegis provide onboarding, offboarding, provisioning of workers, et cetera? So maybe, Laura, you can kind of step through what we're doing today and then where that fits into where we want to be tomorrow with some of that scope piece.
Yeah. So this applies to professional services purchasing. It does not, apply to all of our other categories. We have a whole separate buying program for things like software or any number of things that you might procure at Microsoft. So very specifically, our program and the related policy is scoped to handle contingent staff, which we define it as a resource that Microsoft selects and directs. It's really important, right? To be super clear and able to contrast it with the other types of resources and other types of buying. So that's the scope of it. Sorry, Jazz, what was the other part of the question?
Yeah, so that's the scope of the program. Where are we headed next? I know there's some, so it's a little bit of a combination of,
yeah. So where we're headed next is the program is in 21 countries today. We're evaluating program expansion. Right now we're taking a slight pause. We're gonna go there probably in our next fiscal year. Right now, we're taking a moment to really focus on efficiency, automation, and incorporating AI into our user interface and doing some qualitative things like that as well in the program. So that's really, really important to us too, to ensure that we're always running a modern program. That said, there's a lot going on under the hood. Right, everything from purchase order creation, provisioning, very little integration with our VMS Beeline today. And that was part of the question somebody asked. I remember now. Does Allegis? Yes, Allegis does for staff augmentation. They do handle requests for provisioning, right? So we have an HR team that actually extends access, for example. But the Allegis agents handle the request and monitor and track that. They also raise the purchase orders to support all of the transactions. They're very much, part of what we call the back end functionality of the program too. And then I'll throw this in here because it's super important too. Putting a policy out there saying you must, it's all great as long as you can control it, right? The control gates that we put in place when we rolled this out, they're not strong enough, right? So yes, we've gotten up to, 70%-ish adoption, sometimes a little higher than that. We still see leakage, which tells us that our control gates are not good enough. And we know why. We control it very far downstream in the actual PO process. If you try to procure staff augmentation resources outside of this program, you'll get redirected by our buy desk and told you can't do it and all of that, which is a really unpleasant experience if you're the person who didn't realize that you needed to purchase something this way. So we will focus on creating a front door, one point of entry for procurement at Microsoft. Something that's kind of on our next horizon is get the control gate way further upstream. It's tighter control, forces everybody to go through, get categorized, and get to the proper buying channel. That's a tough piece. It's a big focus.
Yeah, and related to the buying channel piece, one of the things that we also were able to implement off the back of the mandate was a direct sourcing program, so that we could leverage the power of the Microsoft brand. That mandate directly enabled us to be able to launch that program. One of the tomorrow ideas is to continue to expand that. Mark or Chris, I don't know if you want to speak to what that looks like for you all.
Yeah, Mark, I think you had some points you wanted to talk about.
Yeah, so the mandate, definitely helped, speed up and expedite the rollout of the of direct sourcing in the program. Using Talentnet as the technology around it, and Beeline as the VMS as well. I think what you're saying there, Laura. The plan going forward is to expand that wider, potentially geographically, but also from a skill set and from a skill set perspective as well. But I think the mandate itself certainly helped us have a wider visibility and a greater lens on the entire population, I think, of workers within Microsoft. And that helped us increase exponentially the number of, or the percentage of competitively sourced requisitions, which then increased or helped get a cap on spend within the business. So yeah, it's definitely an exciting time. 2025 is going to be hopefully another busy one.
Busy.
The busy one.
Very much so. Yeah, and Chris, I'll let you have the just kind of the last piece before we close out, just on some of that technology piece and where we're headed in that direction next.
Yeah, absolutely. So to Laura's point, we are looking to find efficiencies within our program to make sure that, from end to end, we're leveraging, APIs that exist, making sure that our roadmap within our internal structure for the tools that we utilize, whether it's for PO creation, whether it's for onboarding, that we have a full assessment end to end on how our program can plug in and integrate into that, especially when we start thinking about what we're doing to, firm up some of our controls and what we're calling guided buying, right? So as we're pushing people into the right channels, at what point do they interact with our tool and our team? What point do they go to other channels? And then how do we make sure that the user experience is streamlined so that they're not having to, swivel chair and access different systems, where they can just go into our program. And so we've worked with the Quantum Work Advisory Group not too long ago. We did a full end-to-end assessment of our program just to make sure that when we're talking about things like, bringing in AI into our program, how do we streamline our shortlisting? How do we make sure that, we're using our program specialists, in more strategic ways versus having to do more manual pieces? Like, we're really walking through and looking at that to make sure that we have a full understanding of what we can do from a Microsoft perspective in partnership with Allegis to build our program in a place where it's more of a top-notch, best-in-class program.
That's fantastic. Well, I appreciate the time. I know we have 1 minute left, and I know there are probably a couple more questions that folks have. So if you have more questions or you're interested in learning more about what we talked about today or evolving your program, you can visit allegisglobalsolutions.com. There's a contact linked out there. But we really appreciate the time. Thanks for carving out an hour with us, and hope you have a great rest of your week. Thanks
Yeah.
all.
Thanks.